Hello students, in the last session we discussed about respiration, which is a chemical process which requires a breakdown of glucose. So the oxygen which we take in by the process of breathing is then used to break down glucose in each and every cell. Okay, the glucose goes to each and every cell, and in that cell what happens when the oxygen reaches, the glucose is broken down to produce energy in the form of ATP. This is what says about respiration. Since the glucose breakdown takes place in each and every cell, the respiration is said to be cellular respiration. Okay, it is said to be cellular respiration. Why? Because it goes to each and every cell. Now, as we discussed in the last session, there are two types of respiration: aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Aerobic, air. Air meaning in the presence of oxygen. Do glucose also break down in the absence of oxygen? Yes, glucose do break down in the absence of oxygen, but that process cannot be carried for a longer time in human body. Okay, let's see what happens in the presence of oxygen and what happens in the absence of oxygen. First, we will talk about aerobic pathway for glucose breakdown in mitochondria. Now, we studied in grade 9 about different cell organelles. There is an important cell organelle said to be mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell. Why it is said to be the powerhouse, you remember? Because it generates an energy-rich molecule, that is ATP. And how ATP is generated? When glucose is broken down. So let's see what happens when glucose is broken down in the presence of oxygen. Okay, so it is said that glucose, which is a 6-carbon compound, C6H12O6, the molecular formula of glucose, is first broken down into cytoplasm into a 3-carbon compound, which is said to be pyruvate, and some amount of energy is released, again in the form of ATP only. Okay, so this first step, this glucose is broken down in 2 steps. The first step is glucose is converted into pyruvate and energy in the cytoplasm itself. Suppose this is your cell and this is your mitochondria. So glucose is present in the cell. So glucose will be converted into pyruvate here in the cytoplasm. Okay. And then from here the pyruvate will enter mitochondria, and in the mitochondria further the pyruvate will be broken in the presence of oxygen. So oxygen from the cell will enter the mitochondria, and then this oxygen will break down what exactly? Pyruvate. And what it is breaking down into? Water, carbon dioxide and energy. So the end product, glucose, will be finally broken down into water, carbon dioxide and energy, and it is said that it releases 36 molecules of ATP. Okay, how much amount of energy is generated when one molecule of glucose is broken down? When one molecule of glucose is broken down, it is said that it releases 36 molecules of ATP. Okay, so important points here are: first step takes place in cytoplasm, second step takes place in mitochondria, and in the second step is oxygen which comes into picture. Okay, first glucose will be converted into pyruvate in the cytoplasm, and then the pyruvate will enter the mitochondria where it will convert it into water, carbon dioxide and energy. And how much energy will be released? It is said that 36 molecules of ATP is the amount of energy which is released when one molecule of glucose is broken down in the presence of oxygen. Okay, let's talk about anaerobic respiration. Now, anaerobic respiration, we generally study 2 types. It is yeast, anaerobic respiration taking place in a living organism called yeast, and hence it is said to be yeast fermentation. And some kind of anaerobic respiration also takes place in our muscle cells. So you have to remember the particular cells. It does not take place in a heart cell, kidney cell. It takes place in the muscle cells only, and it is said to be lactic acid fermentation. Okay, so you have yeast fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Now let's see what happens in muscle cells. So glucose, which is again a 6 carbon compound, we know the molecular formula C6H12O6, which is broken down into pyruvate and energy is released. That is the same as it is happening in aerobic respiration. But when this pyruvate enters mitochondria, there is no oxygen. Hence, the pyruvate remains in the cytoplasm only, and it is broken down into lactic acid, which is or converted into lactic acid because it is a 3 carbon compound. So you cannot say it is broken down. It is converted into lactic acid and energy is released. Only 2 molecules of ATP is the energy which is released because glucose is not completely broken down. It is said to be incomplete breaking down of glucose when there is absence of oxygen, lack of oxygen. If there is no oxygen, pyruvate can only change its structure to lactic acid and some amount of energy can be released, and only it is said that 2 ATP of molecules of energy is released in anaerobic respiration. Once again, 2 types of anaerobic respiration. Lactic acid fermentation generally takes place in human muscle cells. So what happens? Glucose is converted into pyruvate plus energy, same as the aerobic respiration, but then it is later on converted into lactic acid plus energy in the absence of in the absence of oxygen, and only 2 molecules of ATP are there, and both this reaction takes place in the cytoplasm itself. Okay, now here comes one important question which says that what happens if lactic acid gets accumulated in our body? So in our muscle cells, what will happen to the lactic acid? It will not further break down since it is not having oxygen, or our cells are not having oxygen. So it gets accumulated in the body. So we respire anaerobically generally when we say do some physical exercise. When we do some physical exercise, we require lot of oxygen or we require lot of energy to do that physical exercise. But the oxygen we take in is not enough to fulfill the energy requirement we want when we do physical exercise. Hence, how are we undergoing this physical exercise? Because additional amount of energy is released by our muscle cells which are performing anaerobic respiration. So suppose I require 50 joules of energy. So I get 40 joules of energy from the oxygen I breathe in. But from where will I get 10 joules of energy to do my physical exercise? So I get it from anaerobic respiration of my muscle cells. So my muscle cells will respire anaerobically and generate some amount of energy that will give me 10 joules of energy. But at the same time, there is lactic acid being deposited in my muscle cells. Hence, after this strenuous physical exercise, what happens? There is a pain in my legs, my hands, and my muscles. Why? Because this lactic acid got accumulated in your body. Okay, so generally there is a question being asked in your exams that why do we have pain after physical exercises in our muscles? So it is because of the accumulation of lactic acid. You can say to meet the energy requirement during physical exercises, muscle cells respire anaerobically, which lead to the formation of lactic acids, and lactic acid gets accumulated in our body, which leads to the pain in our body. And generally, after pain, we keep a hot water bag wherever we have pain. Why? Because when you keep the hot water bag, what happens? The blood circulation in that area increases. And when the blood circulation increases, what happens? There will be more and more oxygen coming to that particular area. And when oxygen is there, the lactic acid is further broken down into water and carbon dioxide, and energy is released. And when this lactic acid is broken down in the presence of oxygen, then but obviously the pain goes away. Okay, so lactic acid formation is not good. To some extent, it is done by our muscle cells to fulfill our energy requirements, and later on, if you want to cure it, You have to use hot water bath so that the blood circulation increases. What will happen if the blood circulation increase? Oxygen will enter in, and if the oxygen is entering in, what will happen? It break the lactic acid into carbon dioxide and water and help you relieve the pain. Studying about the last part, that is what happens in the yeast cell. When there is no oxygen, do the yeast respire anaerobically? Yes, yeast respire anaerobically. Same, the first step is also same here, that is glucose is broken down into pyruvate and energy in the cytoplasm. But when there is no oxygen available, here it is broken down into ethanol, which is a 2 carbon, and 1 carbon converts into carbon dioxide and energy is released. Again, the energy is only 2 molecules of ATP. So in all, in anaerobic respiration, less energy is produced, whereas in aerobic respiration, more energy is produced. Anaerobic respiration, you will only have 2 ATP. Aerobic respiration, you have 36 ATP which is formed. You can see the difference. But the organism survives by respiring anaerobically. And please remember these equations. It is very important. If they ask anaerobic respiration, you have to write about both, in yeast also, in muscle cells also. So lactic acid fermentation and yeast fermentation. So glucose broken down into pyruvate gives energy. Pyruvate further broken down into ethanol, which is a kind of alcohol, right? Ethanol broken down into, ethanol plus carbon dioxide plus energy is formed. Okay, very important. This is a summary of all the reactions. That is the same step. Glucose is broken down into pyruvate, and pyruvate is further broken down into yeast and lactic acid when there is anaerobic respiration, and when there is aerobic respiration, it's broken down into carbon dioxide and water. Okay. Last difference between presence of oxygen, absence of oxygen. Then more energy is released, less energy is released. One step takes place in cytoplasm, other in mitochondria, whereas here the both steps takes place in cytoplasm. It takes place in most of the cells. It takes place in yeast cells, muscle cells. Okay, that is a basic difference which you can gain from the equations itself. If you have any doubt, please write in the comment section. Do like my videos and subscribe my channel. Thank you so much.